All right, folks, let's take a look at section 5. Here is the focus question for us. For African Americans, the Revolution's ideals in the war presented an opportunity for freedom. In 1776, one-fifth of the new nation's inhabitants, about 500,000 people, were enslaved. Slavery was central to the language of the Revolution. Other than liberty, it was the word most often used in this era's legal and political writings. Slavery, often defined as the opposite of liberty, was primarily political in its meaning and signified the denial of an individual's personal and political rights by arbitrary government. Even slave owners resisting or fighting the British expressed that they were enslaved by their enemies. By the Revolution, slavery was entrenched in every American colony. Nearly every founding father, North and South, owned enslaved people at some point. When writing of man's unalienable rights to liberty in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson owned more than 100 enslaved people, all of whom made possible his pursuit of leisure and of arts and sciences. Some patriots argued that slavery for blacks allowed freedom for whites by removing the dependent poor from the political nation and giving white men economic independence. John Locke's vision of the political community as a group of individuals who contracted together to protect their natural rights was also used to defend slavery. The rights of self-government and the protection of property from government interference, some argued, prevented the government from interfering with their human property. These whites complained that government intervention with their slave property would make slaves of them. By making liberty an absolute value and defining freedom as a universal entitlement rather than a set of rights limited to a particular place or people, the revolution inevitably led to questions about slavery and its status in the new nation. Before independence, slavery was rarely discussed in public, even though enlightened opinion had come to see the institution as immoral, inefficient, and a relic of ancient barbarism. Quakers in the late 1600s had protested slavery, and by the American Revolution, many Pennsylvania Quakers had come to oppose slavery. Only with the Revolution, however, did slavery emerge as a subject of public debate and controversy. Many enslaved people realized that the revolutionaries' definition of liberty as a universal right opened the door for them to use this language to challenge their bondage. African Americans were the most persistent advocates of freedom as a universal entitlement, and they pressed revolutionary whites to follow their own principles. In the early 1770s, enslaved blacks in New England presented petitions to courts and legislatures asking Americans fighting English tyranny to end the tyranny that Americans exercised over their slaves. The war offered opportunities for escape, the incidence of which seemed to increase during the conflict. Most enslaved people of the Revolutionary era were only one or two generations removed from Africa, and they did not need the Revolution's ideology to persuade them that freedom was a birthright. Some, such as Phyllis Wheatley, had learned to read and write before the war. A volume of her poems had to be published with a prominent white's testimonial to her authorship, illustrating whites' unwillingness to accept blacks' intellectual ability. Yet by invoking revolutionary ideology to demand their own rights and define freedom as a universal entitlement, blacks demonstrated how American they had become, even as they sought to redefine what American freedom meant. Although 5,000 enslaved people fought for American independence, by which some gained their freedom, many more slaves obtained their liberty by siding with the British. Several proclamations by British generals offered freedom to enslaved people who enlisted in the British military. Nearly 100,000 enslaved people, including many in Georgia and South Carolina, escaped and fled to British lines. Although by the end of the war many had been recaptured, nearly 20,000 formerly enslaved people faced being returned to their owners, like George Washington, who insisted that they rejoin those owners. But the British refused, and many emigrated to England or other British colonies. The issue of compensation for the enslaved people who departed with the British poisoned relations between Britain and the United States for decades. And in 1827, Britain agreed to make payments to 1,100 Americans who claimed improper loss of their enslaved property. The Revolution seemed briefly to threaten the perpetuation of slavery. During the war, most states banned or discouraged the further importation of enslaved Africans, and the conflict devastated many southern plantations. In the 1780s, a significant number of slaveholders, especially in Virginia and Maryland, emancipated their enslaved people. This happened only very rarely in the other southern states, such as South Carolina, where leaders rejected the idea. They would rather lose the war than lose their enslaved people. Between 1777, when Vermont's new constitution prohibited slavery, and 1804, when New Jersey banned slavery, every state north of Maryland moved toward emancipation. This was the first time in history that legislatures had acted to end slavery. But even in the North, enslaved people's importance as property shaped the way emancipation unfolded. Most Northern laws allowed for gradual emancipation. Living enslaved people were not freed. Only the children of enslaved mothers would become free after serving the master until adulthood to compensate for the loss of property. Many Northern slave owners were just as reluctant as Southerners to emancipate their enslaved people after the war. The Revolution had a contradictory impact on American slavery and American freedom. Emancipation in the North, however gradual, came to distinguish free from slave states, and Northern abolition, voluntary emancipation in the South, and slavery escapees created large free black communities for the first time in American history. A dangerous division between North and South began to emerge. Free black communities had their own leaders and established their own independent churches and schools, and became a challenge to the institution's logic, a haven for fugitives, and a springboard for future abolition efforts. In all new states except Maryland, South Carolina, and Georgia, free black men who met tax-paying or property requirements could vote. The widespread use of the term citizens of color suggested that the first generation of free blacks, at least in the North, formed part of the political nation. Nevertheless, slavery survived the war and thrived in its aftermath. By 1790, there were 700,000 enslaved people in the United States, 200,000 more than had existed in 1776. For many Americans, white as well as black, the existence of slavery would henceforth be recognized as a standing affront to the ideal of American freedom. So, that was our fifth section. We'll be back with you for the next one.